Welcome to the Avro Heritage Museum podcast, supported by Museum Development North and Arts Council England.
Hello and welcome from me, Chris Beswick. Today we're bringing you the first of a two-part episode which we've called A Tale of Two Ansons. This iconic Avro aircraft is probably best known for its maritime reconnaissance role. It was for this reason, presumably, that it was named after the 18th century Admiral George Anson, and also for its enormous popularity and effectiveness as a training aircraft. The first of our two Ansons at the museum is in the form of the cockpit of the aircraft affectionately known as Aggy Paggy, a reference to its civil registration letters, Able George, Peter George. It was built in 1945 as the prototype for the Mark 19 Anson. Avro used it initially as a company hack aircraft, transporting what would probably have been senior Avro executives. In 1961, it was sold on and later on ended up in the hands of a company called Echo Electronics, where it played a significant role as a test bed for technical developments on a futuristic aircraft that would become known throughout the world. I joined Avro member Steve Barron in the cockpit of Aggy Paggy to find out more about this first Anson.
Hi, we are currently in the main display area of the Avro Heritage Museum, and just beside our Lancaster nose you'll find our nose section of Aggy Paggy, Golf Alpha Golf Papa Golf, colloquially named Aggy Paggy by the pilots and crews who worked on her. Shall we have a wander around?
Yes, we'll have a look around the outside of the nose section.
We've currently got the forward nose and the cockpit, and very unusually this aircraft has a different nose section which showed the different modifications and the things that the Anson was very, very useful for. Okay, we can see she's got this bulbous radome fitted, which was an attachment fitted to test Concorde's E320 weather radar system. So it shows you how far into the future from World War II, if you like, the aeroplane flew on until, if we're now talking about Concorde. The cockpit that you'll see is in Echo Avionics colour scheme, which is a caramel, black and white, brownish air scheme, and looks very neat considering its age to me. It was very poorly treated, unfortunately, prior to a guy named Michael Parr, I think it was, who restored the nose section. He cut it off the fuselage, which had been very badly neglected, and restored to what we've got today. From outside, we can see we've got two seats. One's rather more upholstered than the other, but I think that shows the structure of the seating, so that you could see at the time what was considered weight saving or strong enough for a person to sit upon. We've got a full cockpit suite. We've got the control column. You see the throttles. You'll see all the instrumentation on the dashboard. The panel itself is very clean, very neat, very easy to read if you understand aircraft. You'll see the two-engine instruments, the artificial horizon, and the altimeter, which would tell you the height, and probably a compass, which I can't quite see from my viewpoint at the minute. There's even stuff that I'm not quite sure I understand, Chris, on this side. It looks like a screen, which is probably the radar screen's operator's position, whether it was in conjunction with the weather radar or if it was its own system, I'm not quite sure. Just outside the cockpit, you'll see quite a rudimentary, would you call it, Chris, windscreen wiper system. And I presume the spray nozzles are just a bit further forward, which would have cleaned the screen for the pilots. And they would have had really quite good visibility all around and above, because the windows do stretch quite some way.
I think I'd read, did they not call it the greenhouse because it had so many windows?
Certainly when it was the very early versions and prior to them becoming more civilian rolled, yes, because I think that might made them quite noisy when they had that windows, but I think they got some more level. I think they were still noisy further in the life, but I think they would have got a bit more comfort out of having a bit more insulation, maybe.
One aspect of the Anson that might be worth mentioning is the Battle of the Beams. Do you want to say a little bit about that and the role that the Anson aircraft played?
Yeah, during the Second World War, the British were becoming convinced that the Germans had some kind of bomb aiming or direction finding equipment, and it was using, they reckoned, a couple of beams, two beams. And I think if you think of Morse code, one of them fired out dots and the other fired out dashes. And when the two combine, you heard a continuous note in your ears. And I think the note then changed when you got to the target. And one particular target that was particularly devastated and showed the power of this system was Coventry, when that was blitzed very early in the war. So some people in the higher echelons of the Air Ministry really didn't believe that these beams existed, but Winston Churchill was convinced enough by a certain scientist named R.V. Jones to send an Anson aeroplane up with a crew to search for these beams. And apparently it didn't take them too long before they did actually find the beams and proved the existence of this system, which allowed us then to go on to create systems like OBO and the H2S ground terrain following radar, which the Lancasters used. So yet again, just another use of one aircraft. Brilliant design.
Should we go inside now?
Okay.
Let's go inside.
So as we're entering, we've got a forward section of the cabin where possibly 2 seats would have gone. Probably would have had 4, 6 seats in the cabin. It depends on what they would configure the aircraft for. And if they were studying Concorde's weather radar, there may well have been a radar station to be observed for an observer's position here in the background. Further through, we've got our cockpit. We can see the rudder trimmer handle. We can see really what they would have seen just obviously a little bit further back. There's a little bit of instrumentation, which I think was for the radios in the top of the windscreen. I think we can see in the roof as well. Would I say that's an escape hatch at the top there, Chris?
Yeah.
Not quite sure how you'd have got out of it, but oh yes, it looks like those things turned to the side. But I never heard of very many incidents with Ansons. There have been a few, obviously, but very, very faithful, reliable, rugged, sturdy aircraft from everything I've read. So obviously a favourite with the crews as well.
So tell us a little bit about this particular aircraft now, because it didn't do war service. It was really surplus after the war and then converted for civilian use. And it came into the hands of Avro, didn't it? Tell us a little bit about Aggy Paggy.
This particular aircraft was the 1,212th set that was built, and she was built in 1945 at Yeadon. And Avro then kept her to be used as a company transport. She had a configuration at the time meaning she could carry 7 passengers and 2 crew. Our Woodford test pilot, Jimmy Orrell, apparently flew her very regularly. I think I'm right in saying that she was the prototype Avro 19, and I think it may well have gone on to be one of the first as well to have metal wings, because that was, I think, one of the specifications of the 19, changing it from the more fabric-covered wing. She stayed with Avro for 16 years, was used as a development test bed for new equipment and upgrades as they came along, such as the weather radar for Concorde. In 1952, she was sold to Skyways Limited, and by now she had her metal wings fitted, and this then made her an Avro 19 Mark II. She even got uprated Cheetah Mark 17 engines. In 1967, the aircraft was sold to Echo Electronics, which later became Pi Telecommunications, and they used it as a testbed aircraft for things like we've mentioned earlier, the radar, etc. This led to the aircraft being fitted with the bulbous nose that we see today, so anybody coming might not really recognise the nose from Anson and wonder what it is. So that's it. It obviously showed that it must have been quite a bigger system than the nose would have accepted. After being scrapped, the aircraft was housed at Southend Air Museum, where she was badly neglected, and a complete restoration was too costly, so the nose was cut off and the cabin section that we have today to be restored, and the wing actually went to Australia for a restoration out in Australia on an Anson that they've got. This was then gifted to Houghton Park Trust, who then gifted it to Avro Heritage Museum, where it's now a free-to-view attraction for museum visitors. It's a bit too small, unfortunately, to have like a tour of the aircraft, so we allow people to just come and view it at their leisure, and particularly children quite like it because they seem to be, they feel like they're really in an aeroplane. So it's quite a useful exhibit on many levels, I find.
Why was it so popular as an aircraft then, Steve, do you think?
Well, The Anson soon proved itself to be reliable, safe and sturdy, very adaptable whether working for military or in the civilian roles as airliners. I believe they were quite noisy and a little bit drafty, but very useful as freighters and particularly for the postal service, it seems. The Air Ministry or the Royal Air Force seemed to use them as well as like taxis between bases if the top brass had to get somewhere, so very useful for those. It was very manoeuvrable and fast for its time, although, like I say, were a bit cold and noisy. The aircraft had a spacious, versatile main cabin, which could be laid out in many configurations. It could be a flying school when the military had them, training pilots, and very few were involved in crashes when you consider over 11,000 were produced, and post-war, due to the amount built, there was many spares available. So a lot of airlines would have loved them because they would have had that pile of spares to go through and use up. A multi-role aircraft, which companies loved because they could use one aircraft to do many things, thus making it quite cheap. And over 35 nations around the world bought Ansons, and it very quickly came so reliable it got the moniker the Faithful Annie. If anybody mentioned it, they never really called it an Anson. They'd say, "Oh, going in the Faithful Annie." Some of them were used by the Air Transport Auxiliary during the war to ferry pilots to and from bases, to factories, and therefore, again, like an air taxi for them. They could be adapted via a hole in the side, I've even seen, to carry people who were on stretchers. They would deliver medicines to where they were needed, and very good, I believe, as get a medical crew to where they were needed.
And as we're sitting here in Aggy Paggy, Steve, we also can think back to lots of Avro senior executives who would have sat here, wouldn't they? Because it was used as transport for, I think, largely within the UK rather than abroad. But, there were people like Harry Holmes that did one of the episodes and almost certainly be sitting where we're sitting here. In our podcast episodes, Steve, we will have been talking about two Ansons, the one we're sitting in now, the one that we're restoring, which isn't yet available for public viewing apart from on event days in our storage and workshop facility across the way. But there was a third Anson, and I always think of this one as the one that got away because it was part of Avro for quite a long time, but sadly it then departed. Tell us a little bit about that one. It was a rather striking one. On our studio wall, we have a lovely picture of it, don't we, in its blue livery. Tell us a little bit about that aircraft.
Well, she was called or registered as Alpha Hotel Kilo X-Ray and first flew in 1946, and she was set number 1333. Built again in 1946, I believe at Yaden, and was delivered to a Smith's Aircraft Instruments company and used again as a test bed for flight instruments and navigational equipment at a place called Staverton. It was actually one of the first, if not the first, to have the metal wings fitted to make it a Mark II, Series 19, because it's the same as Aggy Paggy. Meridian Air Maps operated it for a period as an aerial survey craft. She was used as a freighter by Trefield Aviation, and before retiring in 1973, she worked for Kemp's Aerial Surveys. So you can see how many different uses these aircraft really have. It's an amazingly versatile aircraft. She was acquired in 1973 by the Strathallan Collection and moved to Perthshire in Scotland. British Aerospace, at the time, Charles Masefield was director, I think, and he thought it would be really nice to have an Avro museum, a history of what had been and what he'd obviously known and worked with. And so he sent Harry Holmes to this auction in Auchterarder to buy something. And I believe very early in the bidding, the Anson came up for auction, and Harry just chanced his arm, and I believe we got her for £600. A bit later on, I believe that she was actually damaged slightly in the move, and the insurance payout was slightly more than we paid for the aeroplane. So in essence, we kind of got it for free. The damage wasn't too bad either, I don't think.
I was going to say, Steve, as well, we've got a nice display about this, haven't we, just behind us here?
Yes.
And you can see the ticket from the auction, with which Harry put in his bid for the aircraft.
So BAE took or British Aerospace at the time, took ownership of the aircraft in 1980, and mainly as a project for apprentices to gain skills and whilst restoring her to a display condition. It was actually, in the end, rebuilt by people probably like Charles Masefield. I think I've seen pictures of a guy named Eddie Jackson and I think Jack Bolton, who were managers here, who it was decided that the apprentices would get no real value out of working on her because the skills weren't being they wouldn't have gone forward in their skills. There was fabric and there was cloth, all stuff that wasn't being used, and drilling probably not to the standard that would have been wanted on the more modern aircraft. So the ex-employees and management and staff actually took on the build. There was also a lot of help from our Chadderton workforce as well, because they did a lot of maybe machining parts and any design work. I know project management may have been run from there. So ex-employees volunteered to help, and the training school staff, they're all named on a little plaque we have in the main hall and the Anson area. After BAE decided that they didn't want to keep her, they gifted her to the Shuttleworth collection, which is where she remains today and is airworthy. She's since been repainted from the civilian blue scheme into an RAF configuration and is restored with the registration TX176 in a quite striking silver and orange scheme, I think.
Do we know why we didn't keep it? Presumably because the museum didn't exist at that time, and presumably it was storage, or...
I can only presume that, yes, and because it was a flying aircraft, and I suppose they must have known they were going to lose the runway, it would have been a shame to have kept it, I suppose. But we now have two others in a way. We've got, well, three. And we've actually got a very early skeleton, the tubular steel frame, which you can see parts of in this cabin that we're sitting in, which is what everything hangs off in the CAE building with our other Anson. So yeah, we're hopeful with that one that we're going to what I call dress it, so that people might be able to see the very early starts of the production build to grow it from that tube steel to how it has its wooden frames and stringers and ribs put on, and then finally the skin. But that's obviously a few months away.
And again, that might be something that could feature in our new extension.
Yes,
when that comes, yeah. Thanks again to Steve for that cockpit tour of Aggy Paggy. When you visit the museum, you can step inside the rear portion of the fuselage and you'll be able to see the cockpit for yourself. Next time, I'll be talking to Steve and to Pete Jenkins about the second Anson at Woodford, our newly acquired Avro Anson C19 TX214, which has been very generously gifted to us by the RAF Museum Midlands. We will hear how the restoration and refurbishment process is being tackled, and we'll find out how you will be able to view this aircraft in the future. Please join us for that. Don't forget that if you follow or like the Avro Heritage Museum podcast and you have push notifications switched on in your device, you should receive an alert telling you exactly when the latest episode has been released. In the meantime, thank you for listening and goodbye for now.